Welcome back to Winning the Battle for Talent, the podcast where our customer service experts discuss people management, reducing attrition, and helping employees thrive. Let's join the conversation.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to JD Power's Winning the Battle for Talent podcast. I'm Michael Vermillion with JD Power, and with me today are Mark Miller and Scott Killingsworth, also from JD Power, and Brian, Kearney, and Ted Nardin from Fifth Talent. So topic for today is the role of the supervisor in winning the battle for talent. And probably a good starting point here is talking about the interaction or the fit between the supervisor and what has become the at-home model. And so for perspective, why don't we start with, what was the role of the supervisor before COVID and before everybody went to at-home? And then kind of where are we today? And then
Sure.
where should we be? So I know that's a pretty broad-ranging set of questions, Brian and Ted, but I think it should set the table for us pretty nicely.
Sure. And I'll start off, if you think about, a contact center environment and the supervisor, what was, their job experience like and the work experience also of the agent. So if you take a look at what was their role, well, they're face-to-face. They can get a lot of additional communication. They can do a lot more sense and respond. Also, they had a lot of support. Not only for themselves, but for the agent. So, there were other leaders around, other supervisors who could help out if need be. There was IT that was immediate nearby that could just be flagged down, and if the employee needed to go talk to other departments like HR, finance, no problem doing that. So, and probably one of the biggest things that is often underlooked is the support that the agent had from coworkers. Not only socially and all of those things, but on how to actually do their job and how they learned from each other and supported each other. So when you take a look at that, now that you shift to a remote, working at home model, well, what's happened? A lot of that support, number one, for the employee has gone away. And including, yes, there's some chat things that they can do with other people, including coworkers, but it's just not the same. And when everybody sees it, they're really not themselves, and they're not gonna, do a lot of collaboration. They're afraid of what, they might look like if they ask a dumb question. But there was also a lot more, support lost for the supervisor. And now that supervisor is what we call, there's this physical gap now between the agent and the supervisor. And there was a physical gap already between the agent and the customer. And they already knew how to deal with that. So the agent was doing, in their actual job, their job didn't change dramatically, but the supervisor's job did. That physical gap between them and their agent really has caused some problems. Also, with everything's going through the supervisor now. The supervisor is that face of the company. So with all of that, even if they need support, from other departments, they're typically going to their supervisor. So not only is there more work and effort now for the supervisor, they have this challenge of, now I don't have sense and respond and all of these other things that I could, do to connect with my employee. Now I have to be much more intentional and figure out how not only do I engage them and keep them engaged, but also engaged with other parts of the company, including coworkers. So what we did is in one of our studies, we did ask the importance of training. So the question was for a supervisor, to be prepared to lead remote teams. Did you receive any training from your company to do that? And if you did receive it, how good was it? Was it not helpful, somewhat helpful, or very helpful? So if you take the two dynamics of people who didn't receive any training, the supervisors, and those who maybe received some training but it was not helpful, their teams were not doing nearly as well as those who received training that was very helpful. As you saw, the upward trend of all these different metrics for their teams, they were not having problems with adherence and absenteeism, and they were far superior on things like first contact resolution and customer satisfaction. So that just shows you that, you know, the supervisor really has to think differently and, have some additional leadership skills to overcome that physical gap. And once they do, you can see it definitely has an impact on the employee and performance.
Mark and Scott, kind of based on what Ted and Brian covered here in terms of the supervisor and the role of the supervisor in the new at-home model, um, is everything that we've heard so far kind of line up with what we see practically in our kind of day-to-day interactions with the some of the top contact center operations in the world?
Yeah, this is Mark. Absolutely. So, as many of you know, who's listening to this podcast, JD Power has a long history of working with contact centers, and we've been in hundreds upon hundreds of top performers. And through our years, we've seen, and when we actually did a study on performance, we found that the top performers over-index on supervisors. So heavy investment in training, not only quality of training, but proximity to when the job comes under somebody's auspices. Today, you have people leaving and it's next person up, right? So you're an agent, now you're a supervisor, and you're out managing people. And we found that the top performers were very quickly getting those folks who were promoted into training. And so the point being is that supervisors always been super important, and now it's emerging. You can just from all the data that we've collected and what Ted and Brian have collected, that supervisors are even more important. And so in a weird way, this hasn't really changed anything in terms of what we've observed at the highest level, which is, if you want to have a great operation, over-index on your supervisors, because that's really the number one reason why people leave your company, is because that direct relationship isn't where it should be. But now it's even at a whole different level. So top performing companies are really paying attention to this and doubling down on their efforts to help supervisors be prepared to operate in this environment. And I know that Scott and I, we've been in lots of centers. Scott, I don't know if you would add anything to that.
Yeah, I just had a question for Brian and Ted, and based on what Mark said, not only did we see the relationship between the representative and the supervisor critical, but also between the next level of management, who the supervisor reports to, right? Typically, it's called a team manager. Different organizations have different names for that relationship. But I think Brian and Ted brought up a good point. We place all this burden on the supervisor, and we know that it's important, but sometimes we kind of forget that supervisor is a human. They have all the same support needs as the representative, even though they're in a different role. But that relationship with their immediate supervisor, the support that they receive, the tools that they receive, to enable them to do their job, is just as important. So I would just put that out to Brian and Ted. I know we've talked about that frontline supervisor, but what about, that, you mentioned the grind to the actual supervisor, and how organizations try and limit that grind.
Yeah, you're right, Scott. I mean, And we've seen it a lot of different ways, but one of I think the best that characterizes it is to be in interviews or focus groups with the upper management team who really, when we're talking about the grind for their supervisors, begin to drift off into, well, what about our grind? And we spend a lot of time talking about that and the different things that weighs on them, and it goes probably on through the whole organization. And so you're exactly right. A lot of things support those frontline supervisors, and their boss is a big key part of it.
Well, that's probably a good place to stop and wrap up for today. So, Mark and Scott and Ted and Brian, thanks so much for joining us today. And thanks to our listeners as well, and we'll see you next time.